think the interesting thing that we were talking about around the connection between gameplay and emotions, and obviously we laughed a lot playing online Pictionary, but games can also bring about lots of other types of emotion. Choosing the type of play that you want and connecting it to a particular type of emotion, I think is really interesting in conveying different types of information. Has everybody played Monopoly before? Is it common that when you've played Monopoly that you've had an argument? If you play Monopoly with family, or if you play Monopoly with friends, maybe your emotion is different. But if I play Monopoly, particularly when I used to play it with my grandmother, I would get really angry because she would keep certain properties and refuse to sell them to me. And so in that moment, I could be super angry at my grandmother in a way that I would never be in normal life. So gameplay offers this space to kind of explore emotions around a particular topic in a way I think other types of conveying information don't do. 10th one then is exploratory play. And this is when you're allowed to explore all aspects of a world. And for example, here I've put, objects, spaces, and it becomes in that way multi-sensory as well. So you might include touch, you might include smell, and so on. So the example I've given here is LARPing. So LARPing is a live action role play. So you literally take the gameplay and you become the avatar, or you become the character, and you play the game in the real world, but you're changing things in the real world to suit the gaming world. I've never ever had a go at LARPing, but I think it looks amazing. Every time I've heard people talk about LARPing, it sounds a little bit like a treasure hunt. So you have certain tasks and you have to find out certain information about the gaming world or from other players in the gaming world. And I once had a talk from a LARPing expert, and she used to create these live action role-playing environments. And she talked about how she would spend a month building an environment and a gaming world in the real world. So might be outside in the woods or whatever, and people would then pay to come into that world, for a night or for a day and play this game, and they would be given a character, and so it might be a murder mystery or whatever it might be, and I might pass to Domily, okay, you're a professor, and you'd have to get dressed up as that, and they would give you certain things. So it's kind of taking a gameplay narrative and using the world building part that we've been looking at last week becomes the actual world, as it were. So you would find an environment and so on. I think the thing that, again, these kind of plays have been written about in relation to children a lot. So when you think about, as a child, if you played outside, for example, even in your garden, and you might say, or even in a playground at school, and you might say, this part of the playground is a forest, and this part of the playground is where a ghost lives. And none of those things actually exist, but you're making spaces in the real world in order to play out those things. And then again, in the digital context, how do you explore these things through multiple senses? Again, VR is very good at that. And I think we talked previously about virtual reality, and if you keep adding senses to it, does the gameplay become more boring? So you go into the virtual world, and for example, I'm in a rainforest. This is something I've experienced before. I'm in a rainforest, I'm sitting on a chair, and I go into the rainforest in the virtual world, and then other people's staff, they put smells under your nose to make it smell like the rainforest. And each time they do that, it might add to your experience, or it may make you think, oh, who's doing that? And it might pop you out of the experience. And then at one point, somebody gave me a hot cup of coffee, because you're given coffee from the rainforest. And after a while, I started to feel like there was not enough space for my imagination to work. So it was almost like if you add on too many senses into the virtual world, that it took me out of the experience. However, in LARP, I can imagine that because it's not in the virtual world, but the real world, our bodies are adjusted to responding to the images, the smells, the scents, the textures of that space. And it would add perhaps to our gaming experience or playful experience. So another example almost of that is is Secret Cinema. So this was in London just before lockdown. I really wanted to go, but it's how can you take the kind of the parts of a film and turn it into a kind of role-playing games. This was Things, so the Netflix series Stranger Things, and then you create scenarios and key parts of the Stranger Things story in a role-playing kind of scenario. And again, I think there's something very interesting here about fandom. So people tend to become fans of particular brands, and they might start on the TV, or they might start as a board game, or they might start as a book or an animation, and they begin to look for other ways of exploring that narrative. Again, Stranger Things, I watched the series on Netflix. I really liked it. I then realized that Lego was making a Stranger Things Lego set. I ended up not buying it because it was so expensive, but I looked at it and thought, oh, it's really interesting what aspects of the narrative you take and convert to blocks. And then again, the same with the Secret Cinema. I really wanted to go, what key parts do you need to keep to make the narrative similar? 2 years ago, I took a group to the Royal Opera House, and the person there that we met was talking about Cinderella, and she was talking about the story of Cinderella. If you wanted to convey the story of Cinderella, what would be the one point of the story that you have to keep for people to understand that it's about the story of Cinderella? So the trying on of the shoe, that at least they were saying, if you keep that bit in to the story, you can change the rest of the story completely. So you could change Cinderella to a man, you could change Cinderella to a rabbit, you could do all these kind of things to the story, because the story is so well known that you only need to keep that piece for it to be recognized. When over the rest of this term, when you're playing games, try to think about, has this narrative in this game been played or shown in other formats? What are the similarities? What parts of the story, the information as it were, are kept, and which parts are changed? If you're looking into fantasy play, you can then see that if you want someone to go into this fantasy world, you only need to keep certain elements for people to be drawn into the narrative. For example, has everybody seen Stranger Things or not? It's an interesting story. I really liked it because a lot of it has a feeling of the 1980s, which is kind of the era where I grew up. So a lot of the clothes, the props and so on bring me into the story because it reminds me of childhood. So there are all these things, when you're designing a game, for a game to be successful, you have to understand the audience. So when they're designing this TV show, they're appealing to a generation of people who perhaps are interested in other world stories and so on, but also maybe to people of, my age who might like the aesthetics and so on, and those kind of things. So like at the moment, my son watches a lot of people gaming on YouTube. Now, for someone my age, I hate those kind of programs on YouTube. I hate the way they sound. I hate the way they look. They look kind of cheap and boring. But for his age, he's saying it's much more exciting than TV because the people presenting are my age, or a bit older. They're like 15, 16. So again, you have to start to think about, so a lot of people who are designing content for kids who are older start saying, God, kids like really cheap, horrible, nasty TV shows nowadays. But it's not for no reason. It's not because it's a lesser quality, but it fulfills a need for that user. So that's the importance of why I'm starting to get you to think about user experience. So usually in IED, when you come to year 2 and you're designing your experience, you'll get a lot of tutors asking you, who is this experience for? And people commonly say, it's for everyone. Well, no, it can't be for everyone because it won't appeal to everyone. So you have to decide, who do you want to connect this information to? And gameplay is the same. Who do you really want to play this game and why? this. This is an imaginative play where you can pretend that things are otherwise. So again, a classic example, go into a preschool and a child picks up a pretend banana and uses it as a telephone. So there's no telephone, but you want to play a game which is about a telephone. So you change whatever is around you to a type of play. So this was a project from last year where I worked with a group of second year students, and their brief was to work with children to teach them IED methods of narrative development, to take their story and then turn it into a VR experience, which was shown in the V&A Museum of Childhood. But they went into the school, they taught them how to make a timeline, how to develop characters, and they started by showing them a series of dolls' houses and getting them to imagine who might live in there. And one of the things we talked about too was in relation, so you can see this this link to the further reading below, is how do you get, again, in terms of onboarding, how do you get the children into the virtual space so that they're interested in it, feel safe, feel comfortable in that gaming space? So Isabella made these toys, which you can see here on the left. And because VR is just a one-player experience, or this VR experience was, children could play with the actual toys of the characters who lived in the village, in the virtual village, and then they could, imagine the kinds of characters that they had, they could role play and do fantasy play and so on. And then when it was their time to go into VR, they could go into the virtual world and explore the homes of these characters, of these toys. So I think, again, this is a really good example of how can you take play from one platform to another. This one, so mastery play often comes about in relation to if you want to teach some kind of information, so kind of edgy games, education games. You want to allow people to master a particular skill, for example. And I'm going to talk about this later on today. So this is the game that I've been working on for 18 months, which is to try to get children to understand what it's like to have an MRI scan. So in order for them to feel comfortable in having an MRI scan, you need them to understand, what does a radiographer, what does the doctor of the MRI scan do, so that they can master that role, that when they come to meet a doctor in real life, they will then feel comfortable enough to go through that experience. So mastery play is often attached to serious gameplay if you want people to learn a particular serious topic. Object play then is when you explore certain objects predominantly through touch and vision. And again, I will talk about this later. This was a project where I got children to think about how can you get other children to sleep well. And it gave them different objects to explore their ideas about good sleeping. And they designed good ways of sleeping, essentially, for these very, very tired mini Lego figures. So this one here was a suit that would heat up to a nice warm temperature that when you put it on, you would go to sleep. So again, they were exploring narratives, playful narratives through set objects. Role play, this is probably really familiar to everybody. In the virtual world, Job Simulator is a really good example of that. So usually you're playing around with everyday topics, everyday items, and because you have those things around you in real life, you instantly know how to use that narrative in your play because it's very familiar with you. So if you want to take a user into a fantasy world that is completely of your creation, so if you want to take the user, those going to a hospital, for example, a hospital will already be familiar to most of the users, so you can take them into that space and make them feel comfortable. But if you take them off to meet aliens on a faraway planet that you've invented, you have to work harder for people to be comfortable and be able to role play in that, because most people haven't met an alien or been to another planet. And then the last one then is, again, relating directly to kind of historical play or things that we might know. So this is a game called Tokaido, and it talks about traveling the Tokaido route in ancient Japan. And along the way, you get to eat Japanese food, you get to meet historical figures from Japan, you get to look at scenery and so on. So this is the type of play where you take kind of narratives, real world narratives, often historical ones, put them into the game world for people to explore.